The neighborhood was one of those places where people waved politely to each other in the mornings, but didn't get too involved in each other's business. Most families there were busy with work, school, or just enjoying their own quiet lives. It was the kind of suburban street where the loudest sound in the afternoon was usually the distant hum of lawnmowers or kids riding their bikes. Nobody ever expected trouble, and because of that, people didn't think twice about someone knocking on their door in broad daylight. That was why, on this particular Tuesday morning, things took an unusual turn when two men showed up, claiming to be part of the homeowners association. They looked official enough at first glance. Both of them wore clean polo shirts tucked into khaki pants, each carrying a clipboard and wearing lanyards with shiny badges that caught the sunlight. They even carried walkie-talkies on their belts, which gave them an air of authority. The taller one, who had a shaved head and sunglasses, did most of the talking, while the shorter one stood back and nodded in agreement to everything being said. They introduced themselves to the first neighbor who opened the door and explained that they were from the HOA Security Compliance Division and that they were conducting mandatory inspections in the neighborhood. The explanation sounded strange right away, but not everybody noticed. Many people trusted anything that came with the label of official. The tall man told one homeowner that new regulations required them to check for fire hazards, especially improperly stored firearms. He said it was all part of keeping the community safe. Spoke with confidence, rattling off phrases like community safety ordinance and inspection authority, words that sounded convincing enough to most people. Some neighbors, unsure but too polite to argue, stepped aside and let the men walk through their homes. The officers made notes on their clipboards, peeked into closets, and asked questions about storage. They didn't stay too long in any house, but they left behind a feeling of unease. People didn't like strangers looking through their things, but at the same time, nobody wanted to get into trouble with the HOA. That fear of possible fines or penalties kept them from asking too many questions. But not everyone on the street was so quick to believe them. At the end of the block lived Jack, a man most neighbors knew as quiet but disciplined. He had moved into the neighborhood a few years ago after retiring from the Navy. Few people knew the full details of his background, but they had noticed his early morning runs, the precise way he kept his yard, and the respectful but no-nonsense way he carried himself. Jack was a retired Navy SEAL, though he never boasted about it. He lived alone in a modest but well-kept house, spending his days enjoying a quieter life after years of service. When the fake officers knocked on his door, Jack answered with the same polite calm he used with everyone. He looked at the badges, hanging from their lanyards. From a distance, they seemed real, but as soon as he focused on them, something felt off. The print was slightly blurry, the font uneven. To most people, it wouldn't mean much, but to Jack, who had been trained to notice details, it was the first red flag. The tall man launched into his speech about mandatory inspections, his tone firm but friendly. Jack listened quietly, his expression neutral. Inside, however, his instincts were sharp and alert. He had been in enough dangerous situations in his past life to know when something wasn't right. The paperwork they held up had a letterhead, but even that looked unprofessional, like something copied from the internet. There were spelling mistakes in the fine print. He noticed one line said, Home Owner Assoc. Security Department. The word security was spelled wrong. Jack asked them calmly what exactly they were looking for. The tall man explained they needed to ensure residents weren't storing firearms unsafely, that it was all part of fire code compliance. Jack raised an eyebrow. He had attended nearly every HOA meeting since he'd moved in, and he was sure no such rule had ever been discussed. He asked them when this regulation had been voted on, and the two men exchanged a quick glance. Shorter one stammered something about new policies being rolled out across the county. That was Jack's second red flag. Real officials never stumbled like that when explaining rules. He nodded anyway, pretending to believe them. Years of training had taught him that showing your hand too soon could ruin the advantage. Instead of calling them out right away, he decided to play along, observing their behavior closely. He wanted to see how far they would take their act. "Why don't you show me the paperwork again?" Jack asked casually. The tall man held it out, and Jack took his time pretending to skim it. He noticed the fake signatures at the bottom. One was illegible, scribbles, and the other was a typed name with no title. Jack nodded as if satisfied, but inside he was even more certain that these men were frauds. The tall man tried to steer the conversation, asking if Jack owned any firearms. Jack's answer was cool and controlled. "Why do you ask?" The man explained that improper gun storage was one of the leading causes of household accidents, and that their job was to make sure nobody in the neighborhood posed a danger. Jack tilted his head, giving a small smile, but didn't say much. He knew their story was falling apart, but he wanted to see just how bold they would get. He finally told them they could come back later when his lawyer was present. That statement made both men pause. They exchanged another quick look, the kind of glance that said they hadn't expected resistance. The tall man cleared his throat and said they would return at a later time, then quickly ended the conversation. But as they walked back toward their vehicle, Jack noticed something that made his blood run cold. The shorter man, who had stayed mostly silent, turned around and snapped a photo of Jack's garage before getting into their car. The tall one took a quick photo of Jack's license plate. He thought he hadn't noticed, but Jack's eyes missed nothing. Watched quietly as they drove off, committing the details of their car and faces to memory. When he closed the door, he stood in the hallway for a long moment, replaying everything in his head. He had faced enemies in foreign lands, but this was different. These men weren't soldiers or trained operatives. They were imposters, and they were targeting his neighbors under the pretense of authority. What worried him most wasn't what they had tried with him, it was what they had already done to others on his street. Jack sat down at his kitchen table, staring out the window at the quiet street. He thought about the elderly couple 2 houses down, people who would never question a supposed official. He thought about the young family across the street, parents too busy with their kids to double-check an inspector's credentials. Imposters had chosen this neighborhood because it was quiet, trusting, and safe. They believed nobody here would fight back. But they had made a mistake. This was Jack's neighborhood now. And while he wanted a peaceful life after years of service, he wasn't about to let strangers take advantage of the people around him. Something deep inside stirred, the same sharp alertness he used to feel before missions. The imposters thought they had just visited another ordinary homeowner. They didn't realize they had just knocked on the door of someone who had spent his life dealing with threats far more dangerous than them for the rest of the day. Jack went about his routine as if nothing unusual had happened. But inside, his mind was already working. He knew this wasn't the end of it. He had seen the look in their eyes, the hurried way they left, the photos they had taken. They would be back. And when they came, he would be ready. Jack could not stop thinking about the 2 men who had come to his door pretending to be from the HOA. Something about them bothered him in a way that went beyond just annoyance. It wasn't only the fake-looking badges or the sloppy paperwork. It was the way they acted, the way their eyes kept shifting, and the way they reacted when he mentioned his lawyer. Jack had spent years learning to read people, to pick up on the smallest changes in body language, tone of voice, and confidence. Those 2 men were not officials. They were imposters who didn't even know how to carry themselves with authority. Later, that evening, while drinking his coffee, he thought about the conversation again. He remembered the tall man saying it was a new regulation voted on by the county. Jack had sat in on nearly every HOA meeting since moving in, and he knew for sure that nothing like that had ever been brought up. The real HOA mostly talked about small things like lawn maintenance, trash schedules, and whether fences were painted the right color. There had never been anything about firearms or compliance checks, and the county. That was a laugh. Jack had lived long enough to know that if the county passed something, there would be notices, mailers, or even news stories about it. These men had just made up a story on the spot, hoping nobody would question them. The next morning, Jack went for his usual run through the neighborhood. He noticed that a few of his neighbors seemed unsettled. Mrs. Lawson, an older widow who lived on the corner, waved at him, but didn't look as cheerful as she usually did. When Jack slowed down to greet her, she mentioned that the HOA security men had visited her house too. They told her they needed to see if she had any dangerous items stored improperly. She had let them in because she didn't want to get fined. Jack asked her gently what they looked at, and she said they opened her storage closet and even peeked into her bedroom. She laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, but Jack could see she was embarrassed. That bothered him deeply. These strangers had taken advantage of her trust. He kept running, but his mind stayed on what Mrs. Lawson said. If they had gone through her things, they might have done the same to others. Maybe they were looking for valuables, maybe even firearms they could steal. Whatever the case, it wasn't just a scam. It was invasive and dangerous. Jack began to test his own suspicions. That afternoon, he sat on his porch, pretending to be relaxed, but he was really watching the street. He saw the same SUV return, the one the fake officers had used. They parked near another house, and the two men got out with their clipboards again. He watched as they knocked on doors, sometimes entering, sometimes leaving quickly when no one answered. He could see the way they scanned the street before walking in, making sure no one was paying too much attention. They acted like predators, and his instincts told him they were scouting. When they left, Jack went back inside and began thinking about how to handle the situation. He could easily confront them, but he knew that might scare them away before he figured out what they were really after. He decided to gather more information, checked his home security system, and reviewed the footage of their visit. On his porch had recorded everything: the fake badges, the awkward way they stood, and even the moment they snapped photos of his garage and license plate. He zoomed in and paused the frame. Clear as day, he could see the phone in the man's hand and the reflection of his own house in the screen. They had been collecting details not just for inspections, but for something else. Jack knew enough about criminal behavior to recognize patterns. People like that didn't just bluff about being officials for fun. They had a goal, usually money, weapons, or both. And the way they kept asking about firearms told him exactly what they wanted. They were trying to find homes with guns, so they could come back later and steal them. That night, Jack couldn't shake the thought. He sat in the dark of his living room, the faint glow of a lamp beside him, and thought about how his neighbors had been left vulnerable. He had lived through ambushes, raids, and surveillance missions overseas. He could feel the same tension building here in his quiet suburb. These men thought they were clever, but they had chosen the wrong street. They had chosen a street with him on it. The next day, Jack began asking around more casually. He spoke to the young father across the street, who admitted that the fake officers had come by his house too. They told him it was against regulations to keep firearms near children, and they pressured him into showing where he kept his hunting rifle. Jack could see the worry in the man's eyes as he explained how uncomfortable it felt. He said he let them look just so they would leave. The more Jack heard, the clearer it became. These imposters weren't just bluffing. They were collecting an inventory of homes that had guns. They were casing the entire neighborhood. The realization made Jack's jaw tighten. He didn't like the thought of people targeting innocent families, especially those who trusted too easily. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the sky turned shades of orange and purple, Jack prepared a quiet test. He placed a phone call to his friend Mark, a police officer he trusted. He didn't give too many details yet, just mentioned that some suspicious men were pretending to be HOA officers. Mark told him to be careful and to document everything. Jack promised he would, but he also knew he couldn't just sit by and wait. He started preparing in his own way, made sure his surveillance cameras were recording at every angle. He double-checked the locks on his house, and he even adjusted a few motion sensors in his yard. He wasn't afraid of these men, but he wanted to be one step ahead. If they were bold enough to take photos of his house, they might be bold enough to come back. Later that night, standing at his window, Jack replayed the scene of their visit in his mind. He thought about the way they stumbled when he asked questions about the HOA bylaws. A real official would have known the answers immediately. But these men froze, glancing at each other for help. That alone had told him everything he needed to know. They were faking it, and they weren't very good at it. But sometimes sloppy criminals were the most dangerous, because desperation made them unpredictable. The thought that stuck with Jack most was the moment they heard the word lawyer. Their expressions had changed instantly. Their casual confidence vanished, replaced by unease. That was the moment they realized they weren't dealing with someone gullible. It probably planned to pressure him like they did with the others, but instead, they were the ones caught off guard. And then, instead of backing off quietly, they had taken photos. That meant they were still interested, still planning something. Jack leaned back in his chair and exhaled slowly. He had learned in the military that sometimes the most dangerous threats weren't the ones who attacked immediately, but the ones who lingered, waiting for the right opportunity. These men had left, but they hadn't gone for good. He could feel it. He could almost hear the old instincts whispering in the back of his mind, telling him to stay sharp, to stay ready, as the neighborhood slept. Jack sat awake, listening to the silence, knowing that silence could break at any moment. These fake HOA officers thought they had found an easy neighborhood to exploit. But they had no idea that a man who had lived through battlefields was watching them now carefully, patiently, and with the kind of skill they could never imagine. And when they came back, he wouldn't be caught off guard. They would. Jack woke up the next morning earlier than usual. He brewed his coffee, but instead of enjoying it in peace like he normally did, his mind was already racing. He couldn't let go of the image of those two men taking photos of his house. Something about it gnawed at him more than anything else. If they had just been scammers trying to bluff their way into homes, maybe they would have moved on. But the fact that they were documenting details told him this wasn't a one-time scam. It was planned, deliberate, and organized. He decided it was time to dig deeper. He started by calling the real HOA president, a woman named Linda who had been running the association for years. Linda was always professional and took the rules seriously. When Jack asked her if there was such a thing as a security compliance division, she laughed in disbelief. "We don't have anything like that," she said. "Jack, the HOA doesn't even have the authority to inspect firearms. We handle things like lawn violations, noisy pets, and broken fences. That's it." Her reaction confirmed what Jack already knew, but it made the situation heavier. Linda also told him no HOA officers or workers had been scheduled to come to the neighborhood at all. If people had let these men in, it was because they had been tricked by a complete fabrication. Linda sounded worried when Jack explained how the imposters had gone into several houses. She said she would bring it up at the next HOA board meeting, but Jack knew that wasn't going to be enough. This wasn't something a meeting could solve. Well, these men weren't just pretending to be inspectors. They were predators. Jack hung up the phone and turned his attention to his security system. He spent an hour reviewing the footage from the day before. His cameras had caught not only the men at his front door, but also their behavior around his property. He zoomed in on the SUV's license plate as they drove away. The number wasn't perfectly clear, but it was good enough for him to jot down. He also watched the moment they stopped in front of Mrs. Lawson's house, and then the young family's home across the street. They weren't just dropping by casually. They were systematically going from house to house, taking mental notes. The footage gave Jack a chill. He had done surveillance himself during missions overseas, watching targets, studying routines, identifying vulnerabilities. These men were doing the exact same thing here, but their targets were innocent neighbors who had no idea what was happening. Jack decided he couldn't keep this to himself any longer. He called Mark, his police contact, and this time he gave him the full story. Mark listened carefully, then asked Jack to send him the footage and the plate number. "I'll run it quietly," Mark said, "but keep your head down. Don't let them know you're onto them yet." That was easier said than done. Later that afternoon, Jack noticed the SUV driving through again, slower this time. He watched from behind his curtains as the men looked out at the houses, almost like they were deciding something. Jack took out his phone and snapped his own pictures. If they were building a record of the neighborhood, then so was he. As the day went on, Jack started talking to more neighbors. He spoke to Mrs. Lawson again, this time asking for details. She admitted that the shorter man had opened drawers in her kitchen, claiming it was routine. She hadn't thought much of it then, but now she realized it was invasive. Another neighbor, Mr. Thompson, said they had asked about his gun safe and whether it was fire-rated. Jack asked if they wrote anything down, and Mr. Thompson said, yes, they scribbled notes on their clipboard. It was becoming clear to Jack these men weren't just nosy. They were collecting intelligence, the kind a thief would use before planning a break-in. They wanted to know who had guns, where they were stored, and which houses were easiest to enter. That night, Jack's instincts fully kicked in. He treated his house the way he would a forward base during deployment. He checked his locks twice, adjusted his security system for motion detection, and even placed small markers near windows and doors so he could tell if anyone tried to tamper with them. Then he set up a few hidden cameras outside, ones he hadn't used in a while, to cover blind spots. While setting everything up, Jack thought about the families who weren't prepared. Most of his neighbors didn't have cameras or alarm systems. They probably locked their doors, but that was it. If these imposters came back at night, they would have no warning. That thought made Jack clench his fists. He didn't like feeling helpless, and he refused to let his street become a target zone. Later, he sat on his porch in the dark, listening to the quiet hum of crickets. His mind replayed all the signs again, the fake badges, the awkward answers, the sloppy paperwork. The men weren't professionals, but they were dangerous because they were desperate. He thought about their SUV, the way they drove around as if they owned the place. They believed nobody would question them, and that belief made them bold. The following morning, Jack got a call from Mark. "You were right," Mark said. "Plate number doesn't match the SUV. It's stolen." That piece of news confirmed everything Jack had suspected. They were criminals, not officials, not even petty scammers. They were organized, driving a stolen vehicle and targeting specific homes. Mark told him the police were keeping an eye on things, but it might take time to build a case. Jack thanked him, but knew time wasn't on their side. If these men were already casing houses, it was only a matter of days before they tried to hit one, and when they did, someone in the neighborhood could get hurt. That evening, Jack made his rounds more deliberately. He took his dog for a walk, but really he was scouting. He looked for patterns, checking which houses seemed most vulnerable. He noticed that Mrs. Lawson didn't have a single security light. The young family across the street often left their garage door open while the kids played. Mr. Thompson had mentioned that his back fence didn't lock properly. To Jack, all these things were weaknesses, things the imposters would take advantage of. He felt a responsibility growing heavier on his shoulders. He hadn't asked to be the protector of this neighborhood, but it seemed like fate had decided it for him. These people didn't know how to spot threats, but he did. And if the police weren't ready to move yet, then he would have to hold the line. In the meantime, as the sun set, Jack prepared his home as if expecting company. He checked his firearms, not because he wanted to use them, but because he refused to be caught off guard. He set his cameras to alert him immediately if anyone came close. Then he sat back and waited, a strange calm settling over him, reminded him of the nights before missions, and the quiet was almost heavier than the action itself. Hours passed, and the street stayed still. But Jack's gut told him this wasn't over. He had seen the way those men looked at his house, the way they whispered to each other when he mentioned his lawyer. They hadn't given up. If anything, he suspected they were focusing more on him. Now, maybe even curious why he had been so calm when others were so nervous. They might even suspect that he was different from the others, and that was fine with Jack, because while they were plotting, so was he. And unlike them, he had years of training in surveillance, patience, and precision. If they wanted to come back, they were walking straight into the watchful eyes of a man who had dealt with far worse threats than a couple of imposters with clipboards. The night grew darker, and Jack finally allowed himself to rest, though lightly. As if half awake, he knew the quiet would not last forever. They would return. And when they did, he would be ready, not just for himself, but for every neighbor who was counting on a safety they didn't even realize was being threatened. 3 days passed in silence, but Jack knew better than to trust quiet. He'd seen it too many times before, calm on the surface, while trouble slowly brewed underneath. He stayed sharp, keeping his routine steady, but his awareness heightened. Every morning he jogged past the same houses. Every evening he walked his dog, but his eyes never stopped scanning. He noticed when a car slowed a little too much, when strangers lingered, when shadows fell where they didn't belong. It was on the 4th evening that his instincts finally proved right. The sun had barely set when he saw the SUV again. This time it didn't just pass by, it parked at the end of the street. The 2 men got out, but there was a third with them now, a bigger guy with a hard look on his face. They didn't bother knocking on random doors this time. Instead, they walked straight toward Jack's house. Jack felt his pulse steady, not quicken. Years of training had taught him that fear was useless, but calm could save lives. He had already prepared for this moment. Before they reached his porch, he turned on his porch light and opened the door himself. Standing tall in the frame, the tall man from before gave a forced smile, holding up his clipboard. "Evening, sir. We're here again about the compliance issue. You failed to cooperate last time. We have the authority to confiscate your firearms until proper storage is verified." His voice was sharper now, not the fake friendly tone he had used before. He was trying to sound in control, but Jack caught the edge of impatience in his voice. Jack folded his arms across his chest. "Authority?" he said calmly. "Show me the legal document that gives you that power." The three men exchanged glances. The shorter one shuffled uncomfortably, while the new, bigger man took a step closer, as if to intimidate Jack. "We don't have to show you anything," the tall one snapped. "Either you let us in, or we'll report you for noncompliance. That comes with fines and penalties." Jack almost smiled. Their act was crumbling. He could see it in the way their confidence wavered each time he asked for proof. Instead of answering directly, they tried to push harder, hoping fear would work where logic didn't. But Jack wasn't afraid of them, and he wasn't about to. Let them bully him. "Interesting," Jack said evenly. "Because I already spoke to the HOA president. She says no such inspection exists." "So which one of you is lying, her or you?" For a moment, none of them spoke. The tall man's jaw tightened. The bigger man stepped forward again, this time trying to shoulder his way past Jack into the house. That was his mistake. In one swift motion, Jack grabbed the man's wrist, twisted it, and had him face first against the doorframe before the others even realized what had happened. The clipboard clattered to the ground. The shorter man stumbled back, eyes wide. The tall one tried to bark something about resisting authority, but his voice cracked. Jack kept his grip firm, his calm never wavering. "You're not HOA," he said quietly, his tone low and dangerous. "You're not officials. You're criminals. And you just tried to force entry into my home. It's called breaking and entering." The man he had pinned grunted in pain, trying to wriggle free, but Jack knew exactly how to apply pressure. He had learned the art of restraint long ago, and this man wasn't going anywhere. The other two froze, unsure whether to run or fight. "You picked the wrong house," Jack said, his eyes locked on them, "and the wrong man." Before they could make another move, the sound of sirens echoed down the street. Red and blue lights flashed as two police cruisers rounded the corner. Jack had already alerted Mark earlier in the day, telling him his gut said the imposters would be back. Mark had listened. The moment the sirens hit, the tall man panicked. He dropped his clipboard and bolted for the SUV. The shorter one hesitated for half a second before following, but they didn't make it far. The cruiser screeched to a halt, blocking their escape. Officers jumped out, weapons drawn, ordering them to the ground. The big man, still trapped under Jack's grip, tried one last desperate move, jerking his arm violently. Jack responded by tightening the hold just enough to make him yelp, then shoved him forward toward the officers arriving on the porch. They quickly cuffed him while others tackled the two who had tried to run. Neighbors began stepping outside, drawn by the flashing lights. Doors opened, curious faces peered out, and whispers spread through the crowd. Before, but now, they were watching them get dragged away in handcuffs. One officer opened the back of the SUV and whistled. Inside were duffel bags stuffed with stolen property watches, jewelry, electronics, even a few firearms. Jack watched from the porch, his arms crossed again as the evidence piled up. His suspicions had been right all along. These men weren't just scammers. They had been targeting the neighborhood, cataloging who owned what. Planning to strip homes clean? Mark walked up to Jack, shaking his head. "Good call," he said quietly. "You saved us a lot of trouble tonight." Jack gave a small nod. They were getting bolder. If they hadn't been stopped, someone would have gotten hurt. Mark looked at the restrained men being led to. The cruisers? They already hurt people. We'll be sorting through the reports for weeks. At least it ends here. Jack glanced around at his neighbors. Mrs. Lawson stood on her porch, clutching her robe, her face pale. The young father from across the street had his arm around his wife, shaking his head in disbelief. Everyone was murmuring, realizing just how close they had come to being victims. The officers secured the scene, collecting the fake badges, clipboards, and stolen goods as evidence. The three men sat cuffed in the back of the cruisers, their earlier arrogance gone. Now they looked like what they truly were, small-time criminals, who had thought they could get away with something big. Jack stayed calm through it all. But inside he felt a surge of quiet satisfaction. He hadn't wanted trouble, but trouble had come knocking anyway. And when it did, he had handled it the way he had been trained. Clear head, steady hand, no hesitation. As the last cruiser pulled away, taking the imposters with it, the street slowly returned to silence. Neighbors thanked Jack in hushed voices, some shaking his hand, others simply giving him grateful looks, but Jack only nodded. He didn't need thanks. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because protecting people was in his blood, whether on a battlefield or in a quiet suburban neighborhood. When he finally closed his door, the house felt different. Not unsafe, but solid, like it had just been tested and passed. Jack put away the coffee mug still sitting on the counter, then sat in his chair by the window. Outside, the neighborhood lights glowed peacefully again, the danger temporarily gone. He knew one thing for sure. Those men had made a mistake when they thought they could scare him. They had walked straight into the home of a Navy SEAL, and they had learned the hard way that he wasn't someone to be intimidated. The next morning, the street was unusually alive. Neighbors who usually rushed straight into their cars to head for work lingered outside, talking in low but excited voices. People who normally never spoke to each other were standing in small groups, gesturing toward the spot where the SUV had been parked the night before and where the police cruisers had blocked the road. The whole neighborhood felt like it had been shaken awake. Something heavy had hung over them for days without anyone realizing it. And now that the imposters were caught, everyone was processing just how close they had come to real danger. Jack walked outside as he always did, calm and steady. But this time the looks he got were different. Mrs. Lawson, who usually waved timidly from her porch, hurried toward him and grabbed his hand with both of hers. "If it weren't for you," she said, her voice trembling, "those men could have cleaned out my house. They opened all my drawers. They knew I lived alone. I don't even want to think what could have happened." Her eyes watered as she squeezed his hand. Jack gave her a reassuring nod. "You're safe now," he said softly. "That's what matters." More neighbors came over, thanking him in different ways. The young father from across the street admitted he had barely slept, realizing that he had let the imposters see exactly where he kept his hunting rifle. "They could have come back when I was at work and my wife and kids were home," he said, shaking his head. "I feel like an idiot." Jack put a hand on his shoulder. "Don't blame yourself," he told him. "They were convincing on purpose. You did what anyone would have done when faced with someone claiming to be an authority. But now you know. Next time you'll question it." The neighborhood buzzed with conversations like that all day. People traded stories about what the fake HOA officers had done in their homes, asking invasive questions, opening closets, even writing down serial numbers from appliances. The more stories Jack heard, the clearer it became just how systematic the imposters had been. They weren't amateurs wandering around hoping to get lucky. They had been building files on every house, deciding which ones were worth hitting. Later that afternoon, Linda, the HOA president, called an emergency meeting at the community center. Almost the entire neighborhood showed up. Normally these meetings were half empty, with people avoiding them because they were dull and filled with talk about lawn regulations. But this time, the room was packed. The atmosphere was tense at first, then emotional, as people stood and shared their experiences. Some were embarrassed that they had been tricked, others were angry at the invasion of privacy, and many were simply scared at the thought of how close they had been to something worse. When Linda explained that the imposters had been criminals, using fake badges, and that the HOA had never authorized any inspection, the room buzzed with outrage. A few people turned to Jack, murmuring about how he had been the one to stand up and expose the fraud. Linda herself paused, then looked at him in front of everyone. "If it weren't for Jack," she said, "those men might still be out there pretending to be us. We all owe him our thanks." The room erupted in applause, though Jack shifted. Uncomfortably in his seat, he hadn't done it for praise. He just nodded politely, his expression calm. After the meeting, several neighbors approached him privately, asking for advice. One man asked what kind of cameras to install. A woman wanted to know about alarms, and another couple asked how to spot fake IDs. Jack answered every question patiently, explaining simple steps without overwhelming them. He didn't talk about his military background unless someone asked directly, but people were starting to piece it together. The way he had handled the imposters, the calmness with which he described security measures, the quiet authority in his voice, it all spoke of experience. Meanwhile, the police investigation moved quickly. Mark called Jack to update him, explaining that the three men were part of a small, organized crew that had been hitting different neighborhoods. They would pose as officials, sometimes as city inspectors, sometimes as HOA representatives, then use the access to catalog valuable items. Once they had enough information, they would return at night to steal what they wanted. The stolen SUV had been traced back to another burglary across town. The duffel bags filled with stolen goods in the back seat were linked to multiple reports. Thanks to Jack's footage and quick call, the police now had more than enough evidence to put the men away for a long time. Jack listened quietly to all of this, his expression unchanged. When Mark thanked him again for his role, Jack simply said, "Just doing what anyone should do." But they both knew that wasn't quite true. Not everyone could stay calm under pressure. Not everyone could restrain a criminal without losing control. And not everyone could read danger before it even struck. Over the next week, the neighborhood began to settle back into its rhythm, though things weren't exactly the same. People locked their doors more carefully, kept their garage doors closed, and paid closer attention to strangers walking the street. A few houses suddenly sprouted, new security cameras, and one neighbor even joked that thanks to Jack, this place is going to look like Fort Knox soon. Jack just gave a small grin at that. If it meant his neighbors slept safer at night, he didn't mind. Still, even as things calmed, Jack couldn't help but reflect on what had happened. He had moved into the neighborhood for peace and quiet, far away from the chaos of missions and deployments. Yet trouble had found him anyway. It was different this time. It wasn't a battlefield, it wasn't foreign enemies, but the instincts had been the same. He realized something about himself that night as he sat alone in his living room. He might have retired, but the protector in him had never gone away. He thought back to the moment when he had the imposter pinned against his doorframe. The man grunting in pain, his partners frozen in shock. Jack hadn't hesitated. He had acted as naturally as breathing. That instinct, honed over years of training and experience, was still alive in him, and in a strange way, he was grateful. It wasn't just for himself, it was for the people around. Him who didn't have those skills, who still deserved to be safe. Neighbors began to wave at him more warmly, some even stopping to chat when before they barely said hello. Kids rode their bikes past his driveway and called out, "Hi, Mr. Jack," as if he were some kind of local guardian. It was subtle, but the way the community looked at him had changed. He had become the quiet protector of the street, the one everyone knew they could rely on if something ever went wrong again. One evening, Mrs. Lawson brought over a plate of cookies as a thank you. She laughed as she handed it to him, saying, "I know you probably don't need cookies, but it's the least I can do." Jack accepted them with a smile. She hesitated before adding, "You know, we all feel safer just knowing you're here." Jack didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. The truth was, he didn't want to be treated like a hero. He had seen too much in his life to wear that label comfortably. To him, he had simply done what was necessary. But as he watched the street from his porch that night, hearing kids laugh in the distance and seeing porch lights glowing warmly, he realized something else. Maybe this was his new mission, not overseas. It's not in hostile zones, but right here. Protecting ordinary people who just wanted to live their lives in peace. The imposters had thought they were clever, disguising themselves as HOA officers, preying on trust and fear. They had expected compliance, expected to intimidate. What they hadn't expected was Jack, a man who had lived through far worse. A man who could see through lies in a heartbeat. A man who refused to back down when others felt cornered. They hadn't expected a Navy SEAL to be living quietly on the very street they chose to target, and that was their downfall. Jack didn't dwell on it, though. He wasn't one to brag or replay victories. Once the danger was over, he moved on, watching, waiting, ready if needed. For him, the satisfaction wasn't in the praise or the thanks, it was in knowing his neighbors could sleep peacefully again as the days stretched into weeks. Life in the neighborhood returned almost completely to normal. But for Jack, one thing never changed. He remained watchful, because he knew better than anyone that threats could appear anywhere, even behind the disguise of authority. And if trouble ever tried to come back, it would find him waiting, calm and prepared. Because Jack wasn't just another homeowner. He was a protector through and through. And this neighborhood, whether it knew it or not, was safer because of him.